Okay, so we're looking at the desktop on a virtual machine running locally on my desktop, and it has a fresh install of Windows 7. Now this is just what I have available. I'm using it as a stand-in for what would otherwise be a build server, so you may be using a server edition of Windows. But regardless, the instructions should be the same for any version of Windows, Windows 7 or higher. So let's go ahead and get started. The first thing we'll need is to download several software packages. The first software package you'll need is RAD Studio, Delphi or C++ Builder, depending on which product you're building a build server for. Now, your existing license is sufficient for this. Because the build server is an unattended server, you don't need a user license for it. You can use your existing license. However, you do have a limited number of installs against your license, so you should check with your Embarcadero rep that you have sufficient installs in advance before you get started. But go ahead and get your RAD Studio or related product downloaded, ready to be installed. And then we need 3 other products. Now the first one you'll need is a version control server. I'm using Visual SVN. I'm familiar with SVN and I've used it for many years, but you have a range of options here, including Git and Mercurial and a bunch of others. So go ahead and get yourself a version control system. If you're choosing to clone what I'm doing here, the Visual SVN server is actually available for free in the standard edition, and that is for commercial use. So although there are some features restricted in the free version, it's perfectly suitable for commercial use, and you can always upgrade to the enterprise version if you need the features later. So go ahead and get that downloaded. And that is the server side of our source code control system. We also need a client side. Now the RAD Studio IDE has an SVN client built in, so regardless of which product you're using, if it's got the RAD IDE, it's got SVN. However, for the sake of administering the source code on a build server, I would recommend downloading an external client as well, and the one that I recommend is Tortoise SVN because it's very easy to install and use. And so go ahead and download Tortoise SVN, and then we need our build/continuous integration server. So Jenkins does a nice job of being both a build server and a CI server, and so I'm going to be showing you how to use Jenkins in this demonstration. Okay, so let's go through the installation process for each of the packages. You're probably already familiar with the RAD Studio install, so I'll run through this as quickly as possible, but there is at least one option which is important to turn on, so I'll go ahead and point that out for you. Okay, so here in the installer, I'm going to go ahead and select everything. Obviously select the platform and language options that are appropriate for your development environment. And then at the additional options page, I want to make sure that I have my DUnit unit testing frameworks installed, because I'm going to be using the build server to run my unit tests. So I'm going to need those installed on the server side. And of course, install any of the other components that your projects may depend on. And we have our RAD Studio installed. So I'm going to go ahead and click on Start Working, and I'm going to go ahead and select this cool new dark theme. I'm going to leave the defaults here because Subversion is already integrated, but if you need to integrate a different version control system, then go ahead and click in here to set your settings. And I'm going to go ahead and get started. So here we are in our new nice dark themed IDE. Okay, so now let's go ahead and get our version control installed. I'm going to start with the Visual SVN server here. Go ahead and run this. Next, I accept the license agreement. Next. And I want to install the Visual SVN server with the administration tools. That's the reason for downloading the Visual SVN server. I want those admin tools that make operating the SVN server a little easier. And I'm going to add Subversion command line tools in the path environment variable, sure, and click on Next. I want the standard edition because I want the free one here, and I'm going to let it go to the default locations. And do I want to change the backup location? Not for this machine, but you could go ahead and change the backup location if you have a backup schedule for your server. I'm going to go ahead and click Next and install. and click on Finish. And yes, I'm going to go ahead and launch the Manager console. So this is our SVN Server Management console. I'm going to pin this to my taskbar here so that I can get back to it easily. And if you selected the Enterprise Edition of this product, then you can actually integrate the user database with your LDAP or Active Directory structures. But because I'm using the Standard Edition here, we have the SVN server users only. So I'm going to start by putting a couple of users in here real quick. I'm going to create a user for myself. So we'll say Craig.Chapman, and I'll give it a password. Okay, and then I'm going to put a second user in here, which I'm going to call, let's just call it machine. And I'll give that a password as well. Let's use a random password generator for this. So here is my randomly generated password, and I'm going to go ahead and make a note of this, put it on my desktop. Obviously I don't recommend saving your passwords in plain text on the desktop in a file named password.txt, but for the sake of this demonstration, that's where I'm going to keep it. So now I have that machine user. I have a user which is able to check out and check in source code. So this is read-write access for my user. And the machine user I'm going to use as read-only. And that's what our Jenkins server will use to check out copies of the source code. We'll come to that later. Let's continue with our installations. The next thing that I want to install here is going to be Tortoise SVN. Now this is actually the client side for the Subversion or SVN server. So I'm going to double click on this and run it. Next, next. I'm going to go ahead and install the command line tools. Next, and install. And click on Finish. And now that's installed. Now at this point, before we start installing Jenkins, I'm going to restart my server. And the reason is that the Tortoise SVN client actually puts graphical overlays on the Explorer windows, which are very useful, but they only start functioning after you've restarted your machine. So I'm going to go ahead and shut down and restart this box. Okay, so with the server restarted now, let's go ahead and get our Jenkins server installed. So I'm going to come back to my downloads folder, and this is in a zip, so I'm going to extract it. And within the zip there is this install file, so we'll go ahead and double click, run, and this is going to be next, next, and install. Okay, and finish. Now as I finish this, it's going to launch my web browser. So Jenkins has a web-based interface, and it's actually come up almost immediately here saying please wait while Jenkins is getting ready to work. On your system, depending on how quickly it's responding, this might not come up immediately. It may actually say that the website can't be found. Don't worry, give it a minute and refresh. It will come up eventually. It just sometimes takes a little time for the Jenkins server to start up. But assuming you've got it up and running, you should see it on localhost port 8080, and it'll bring you to this Getting Started Unlock Jenkins window. Now what this is saying is that in order to unlock this installation, we need to go find this initial password file. So I'm going to take a copy of that, and I'm just going to open up a regular Explorer window, paste it in, and it's going to ask me what I want to use to open the file. Let's just use Notepad, and it gives me this key. So I'm going to take a copy of this key. I'm going to come back to my Jenkins window and paste that in, and that's going to unlock the Jenkins install for us. Now I'm not going to save this password because we will be providing our own admin password for the Jenkins server in a moment, but this logs us in sufficiently that we can install the plugins for Jenkins. Now Jenkins is built up of a number of different plugins. If we install the suggested plugins, we'll get the most useful or most commonly used plugins. So that's what I'm going to go for, but feel free to explore the plugin repository if you want to specify specific functionality in your Jenkins server. I'm going to go ahead and click on install, and we can see the plugins start to be installed here. It'll take a little while to happen. Now while it is happening, notice that it's installing the LDAP plugin. Again, you can integrate Jenkins with Git, Mercurial, Subversion, with LDAP, with Active Directory for your users, and a whole weft of other software. We won't be going into all of that today, but we will be looking at using some very basic integration with Subversion. So let's go ahead and let this complete. Okay, so now we're at the create first admin user. Now, just for consistency with my SVN server, I'm going to go ahead and put Craig.Chapman in here. Obviously, your options may vary if you're using Active Directory or LDAP and so on. So go ahead and give this a password. And my full name and my email address, Embarcadero.com, almost mistyped that. Go ahead and save and finish, and I guess continue as admin. Okay, Jenkins is ready, and this time I will let my browser save that password so that I'm logged in automatically in the future. So let's go ahead and start using Jenkins, and this is your Jenkins dashboard. So Jenkins is installed. We do have some configuration work to do on it, which we'll come to in a moment, but we now have all of the software installed. So let's go back to our Subversion and take a look at how we set up the Subversion server first. Okay, so I'm going to open up the Visual SVN application here. And if we take a look, we have this little directory here for repositories, and we currently have no repositories installed. We did put 2 users in there, which I'm going to come back to, but there are no repositories and we haven't checked anything out of this server. And we also haven't really completed the configuration of this server. If we click on the Visual SVN server local up here at the top, right click, and let's say properties, we can come in and start setting some of the properties of our server. In particular, if you are hosting your server on a machine in the cloud, then you might want to provide it with a domain. So for example here, where I have Craig Windows 7 VM, you might instead have example.example.com. So that might be the address that your server is hosted at. So come in here and make sure that that is set to an appropriate domain name, and that will alter the repository URL that you get for checking out your source code. You have the option of setting up a self-signed or a purchased security certificate. You have options for authentication. As I said, you can integrate with Windows authentication, but I'm just sticking with the simple Subversion authentication here, and a bunch of other options for logging, security, the web interface, and so on. So go ahead and take a look at the options in here. I'm going to go ahead and leave mine exactly as they are. And then if we come and look in the repositories, I'm going to create a new repository for us. So create new repository. And I'm not exactly sure what the difference between these 2 directory structures is, but my system is not a distributed server, so I'm not going to use the distributed repository system here. I'm going to stick with the regular file system. And then I need to give my repository a name. So let's call this My Amazing Product. So this is going to be a repository into which I put my amazing product source code. I'm going to click on Next, and then I get this choice of, do I want an empty repository or do I want to go with a single project repository? Now, the option you choose here really changes how you work with Subversion. For the simplest use, go for empty repository, and what that's going to do is give you a simple empty directory that you can deposit your source code into. I'm going to show you a slightly more advanced way of working. I'm not going to go into too much detail, but I'm going to start with this single project directory, which is going to give me trunk, branches, and tags. And we'll take a look at what those 3 things are in just a moment. Okay, go next. Now I get the permission dialog. So who has permission to access this repository? I'm going to click on Custom. I'm going to add Craig Chapman. I have read-write access. And I'm going to add my machine, which is going to have read-only access. Now you can set these up as user groups. So if you wanted to, I'm going to go ahead and click on Create to finish creating this repository. Finish. If you wanted to, in groups here, you could go in and create a group. So you might have my development team, and then I could go and add Craig Chapman into the development team. And you might also have a separate machines group for machines which are able to access the repositories and so on. I'm not going to get into that today. There's no real need for it for this demonstration, but you do have options here for configuring your user permissions. Now that I've created a repository, if I click on it here, I can see what's in it, and it has those trunk tags and branches that we talked about when we were creating the repository. And each of those is actually just an empty directory in itself. So it's not actually created anything for us, it's just put 3 dummy directories into my amazing product. Now, one of the nice things with Visual SVN Server, I can right click on my repository here and copy the URL to the clipboard. So that URL is the URL that I need to use to check out this repository. So let's go ahead and do that. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead here and create a new directory on my desktop, my amazing product, and then I can right click and select Tortoise SVN. Remember, this is our client side, so I can use Tortoise SVN to check out. And right above Tortoise SVN in the menu here is SVN checkout. So that's the option I'm going to choose. And automatically the URL has been pasted in here for me because it was in my clipboard, and Tortoise is smart enough to detect that. And this is the checkout directory on my desktop. So I'm going to go ahead and click OK. Now it's going to ask me for my username and password. And I'm going to make sure it saves the authentication here so that I don't have to provide it every time. And it's checked out to revision 1. So this is the very first revision of this product code, and of course it is really just a series of empty directories. So if we take a look inside our amazing product folder, we have branches, tags, and trunk. So these are our empty directories that we can check our source code into. Okay, so now that we have these 3 empty directories, let's discuss what they're used for. This is a pretty common convention under the Subversion control system, and the convention is that the trunk directory is used for the latest stable version of your code. So this version of your code should build and should pass at least its unit tests. So if you're checking into the trunk, this should be the latest working code. Branches is used to add new features. So if you wanted to add a new feature to an existing product source, then you'd want to take a branch from the trunk, which is effectively a copy, and put that in the branches directory. And the software actually has a feature for this. So if we come into Subversion, we can do branch or tag here. So we can create a branch or a tag. We follow through that wizard and it will create a branch for us. We can give that branch a name. So let's say we're adding the feature X. We could create a branch called the X branch. And then we can go check out the X branch on our client machines, development machines, make the feature enhancements, and check it back in. Once that code is complete and passing its unit tests, then we can merge that branch back with the trunk. Now, I'm not going to look at merging today. That can get quite complex under certain circumstances because you're merging 2 different source branches, so there could be conflicting changes on either side, and there are tools built in with the Subversion tools to help you deal with that. And then we have the tags directory. Now the tags directory is similar to branches in that it takes copies of your source code, but the copies in tags are for things like releases or particular version markers. So I could take a tag of my trunk and say this is release 1, and so from that day forth, that is the release 1 version of the code in the tags directory. Now the nice thing about working with a version control system such as Subversion is that if I do take a copy of, say, the trunk directory into my branches, that's not actually going to be a copy on the server. All it's really doing is putting a marker on the directory structure to say, at this point we took a branch. And then any differences that are made on the branch will be stored as the differences only. So it's not going to store a new copy of the source, it's just going to store the changes. So that's a really nice feature of working with version control to manage multiple branches and tags. Obviously on the client side, if you check out everything, then you will get multiple copies of the source because each branch will come down as a copy of the main project. Okay, so having explained the branches and trunks, it's quite important, I think, that when we check code into our Subversion repository, we really want the person that's checking that code in to give some explanation of what they're doing. So for example, if they're checking into the trunk directory, why are they checking into the trunk directory? Are they merging a branch? Are they checking in a bug fix? What's going on? If they're checking in a tag, why are they creating a tag at this point? Have they checked that the code is at a release-worthy state? And so on. So what we want to do is to enforce that users have to make comments when they commit their code. If we right click here on My Amazing Product and go to Properties, we have this Hooks tab. Now if we click on the Hooks tab, you can see that we have hooks related to committing code in, as well as locking parts of the code and certain property changes. What I'm interested in right now is a pre-commit hook. So before I allow code to be committed into the server, I want to check that there is at least a comment associated with that code. So I'm going to edit the hook, and I have a bit of code here which I have to admit is not my own, but I'm not able to attribute because I copied this from, I think, a Stack Overflow post many moons ago, and I still use it to this day. So I'm sorry if I'm not able to attribute this, but it is open to the public, and it is effectively a check that the repository has a comment against it. So the text for this hook will be on the blog post that accompanies this webinar, and so you can go download that code and use it in your own hooks if you wish. So I'm going to go ahead and click OK and apply, and now I should be unable to check anything into this repository without a comment. So let's give that a try. I'm going to open up My Amazing Product. I'm going to go into the trunk and I'll create a new file. Let's say a text document, test. Okay, and then I'm going to add that to my Subversion repository. And then I'm going to try checking that in, right click and commit. And I'm going to try checking that code in, but I'm not going to put a comment in here. So I click on OK, and I get this error saying that I've not put a log message in. So try committing again. Okay, great. So now I can't check in code unless I have put a comment against it. I'm going to undo the addition of this file because I don't really want it, and delete that file away. Okay, so as far as we're concerned now, the trunk is current with the version that's on the server, and we can tell that by the little green icon there. Okay, so the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create a project and put it into the repository. And I'll go over those context menus in a little more detail in just a moment as I do that. So I'm going to open up RAD Studio, and I'm going to start a new, let's see, a new project package, new Delphi package. And then I'm going to save that package off into my trunk directory. So if I come up to my desktop here, I have My Amazing Product in the trunk. I'm going to save this as PKG for package, and let's call it My Amazing Product. Okay, so I now have a package with nothing in it. It's just an empty package, but it is saved in my Subversion repository. So now that I have that, I'm going to come back to the Subversion directory here under trunk, and I can see that I have 3 files here that have been generated by the IDE. Now the first 2 are the project files, so I'm going to add those to the repository. Now if I right click and go to Tortoise SVN and add, what I've effectively done is add those 2 files to my local copy of the source. They're not yet up on the server. They've just been added on my client machine. Now obviously at the moment I'm using the server to be both client and server, but this is my client copy right here. And the third file here, this .local file, well, that's going to be generated automatically by the IDE every time I open the project, so I don't want to check that into Subversion. And the reason is, if I check that in, then every time the IDE recreates this file, it'll look like changes have been made, and I'll have to check that into my Subversion repository, just wasting space. There's no need to check it in because the IDE generates this on the fly for us. So what I'm going to do is ignore that. So I can right click, go to SVN, add to ignore list, and let's just say, I'm going to say star.local, so wildcarding any .local file recursively in any subdirectory of the trunk. So I've now added that to the ignore list. Let's go ahead and check this code in. So I'm going to right click on the trunk. You see I came up to the trunk here. I could have done this another level up. I could right click on My Amazing Product and commit there, but I've only made changes in the trunk, so I'm going to do it at this level. SVN commit, and you'll see that the IDE has also created this hidden directory called history. So we don't want the history directory. This is for recovery. If the IDE should fail for some reason, it has files that it can recover from the history directory. So I'm going to right click on the history directory and add that to the ignore list as well. And so we can see that I'm checking in modifications to the trunk directory. Now those modifications are property changes. That means the ignore files that I've added, so they've been put into the directory properties. And I'm also checking in my dpk and dproj files. So let's say initial check-in. So this is my comment, which should allow the check-in to happen now. And I click on OK. And we can see that the code has been checked into the repository here, and I'm at revision 2. So the first revision was the empty directories that were created by the SVN server. Revision 2 is my first commit, my first check-in to that server. Okay, so we have a project going into our directory here. Let's add one more project, and obviously you can arrange your directory structures however you'd like. So within the trunk you can put, say, a source directory, an out directory, and so on. In fact, usually I like to separate source from binary data, because I also don't want to check binaries in to the Subversion repository. The compiler can generate those binaries from the source code. There is no point me loading them into Subversion, and quite frankly, sending binary files to the server every time I check in is going to be slow, and I don't want to have to wait for it when I could just build the executable client side. So you can arrange this directory structure however you wish. I'm just going to go ahead and dump everything into trunk for right now, but I do recommend that you come up with a consistent way of organizing your project directory. So let's go back to the IDE, and I'm going to add a new project to my project group. And the new project that I'm going to add will be a DUnitX project. So this is a unit testing project. We're going to create a test unit. I'm going to tell it, yes, create some setup and teardown methods for the unit tests, and create some sample test methods. So we'll go ahead and create that. And then I'm going to save that off. So we'll do a save as. And as I said, I'm just going to dump everything into the same directory here. So under trunk, the unit we'll call test1, I guess. And then the project itself, let's see, I'm going to call this PRJ, my test project. Okay, so I've saved that test project off. And if I hit the save all button, it's now going to ask if I want to save the project group. Well, I think that's a good idea. Let's save that as grp, my amazing product. So again, I'm going to come back to the Subversion directory. Now, I'm going to do this before I hit build, because if I hit build, then we're going to automatically generate directories, output directories, so the Win32 or 64 directory with debug and the binaries within it, and I don't want to check those into my Subversion, and I don't want to have to sift them out while I'm adding files. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come in here before I build the project and add the new files. So here's my PRJ, my test project, the dproj file, the unit file, and up here the project group. So I'm going to select all 4 of those, right click and add, and then I'm going to come up to trunk and commit, and I'll say added unit test project, and we'll commit that in for revision 3. Okay, so let's come back to the IDE, and I'm going to go ahead and do a build or, and then come back to my Subversion repository, and I'm going to right click on trunk and hit Subversion commit or SVN commit to check in, and we can see here that the compiler and the IDE have now generated a whole bunch of files which actually need to be ignored, because these are the binary files. So we've got our Win32 directory with our test project in it, and we've got a couple of resource files which in this particular instance don't need to be checked in. They're going to be generated each time we build the project. So for the Win32 directory, I'm going to right click and say ignore, and I want to ignore the directory recursively, so anything that gets put in the Win32 directory will simply ignore. And then there's also the resource files. I'm going to go ahead and add to ignore list star.res. So that's going to get rid of all of those things that we don't want to actually check in. But what it's done is modify the directory properties for the trunk directory for the ignores. So I'm just going to put a comment in here, ignores, and OK. And we can commit that up to our Subversion repository. Now, this will happen when you add ignores sometimes. you're going to get back a fail, the trunk directory is out of date. Now that's not really an issue. What's happening here is the Subversion system needs to update properties from the server. So we'll hit update, and then it's going to bring us right back to where we were with our commit dialog. So I'll hit OK, and now that is committed in. All that happened there is we committed the ignores in the previous commit, but those changes went up to the server. They weren't stored locally, so they have to be refreshed down from the server before we can submit new ignores. So now that that's happened, we have added those in. If we take a look in our directory, it's getting quite busy now, but we're actually only storing a handful of these files. So let's go and take a look on the server under the trunk directory here. If I do a refresh, we can see that we are storing the project group and a couple, a DPK, a dproj, DPR, another dproj, and the test unit. So these are the only files being stored actually on the server side of this setup. And they're only going to be checked in again if any of them change, and being text files, they're relatively small in size. So now that we have this, let's look at how we get our server to build our test project. The first thing I'm going to do is come and make sure that our test project actually works. So with the project selected, I'm going to go ahead and hit run. And one of the things you'll notice, we've run the tests. We found 3 tests and we run them and they passed. But we now have this press enter to quit. So what this means is that when we run our test suite, there is a pause waiting for user input at the end of the suite. Now this is actually a problem for us, because if our build server checks out our source code and builds and runs our test code, we don't want it to get stuck waiting for this executable to complete because nobody's there to press the enter button. Thankfully, there is an option in the DUnit framework to change the exit mode. So we can change the exit mode so that it doesn't prompt for that exit. So we need to keep that in mind when we write our integration script. Okay, so in order to use Jenkins to build our project, we need to figure out how to build our project from the command line, because we're going to give Jenkins a batch script to execute and to build our project. So I'm going to start by coming into the command line here, and I'm going to change directory into desktop, change directory into my amazing product, and change directory into trunk. And the project that we want to build is prj mytestproject.dproj. Now the way we do this is to simply issue the instruction msbuild and then the project name. However, before msbuild can see our project and understand how to build it, we need to set up the environment variables for our command prompt. And thankfully, Delphi, C++ Builder and RAD Studio ship with a script to do this for us. So I'm going to call that script. So I'm going to put call on the command line here. And then I want to go to my C directory, program files x86, Embarcadero, Studio, I'm using version 19, and then we want the bin directory, and the file that we want is called rsvars.bat. So by running that script, our environment is now set up for the msbuild. And if I type msbuild and then prj mytestproject.dproj, and msbuild will build our project. So we know how to build our project from the command line now, but Jenkins doesn't have access to this source code directory. Remember, this directory represents the directory on our client side. So what we're going to do is set up a script which will enable us to build this on the server side. So I'm going to come to my file explorer. I'm going to browse into program files x86, into Jenkins, and I'm going to put a new directory in here. Now, incidentally, if you are backing up your Jenkins directory using a backup schedule, at least the jobs folder needs to be backed up. This is where all of the information about the jobs configuration is stored. And you'll also want to back up our new directory. So I'm going to create a new one called scripts, because these scripts will be used to build projects from Delphi and to trigger builds and so on. So while in this directory, because this is on the program files x86, I can't create new files here. So I'm going to create a new file using Notepad. And I'm going to go ahead and save this on my desktop where I do have permission to save it. And I'm going to name this build project .bat. So this is going to be a batch file for building the project. And we need to make sure that is a .bat extension, so I'm going to select all files as the filter. So the instructions that I want in here are going to be, first of all, to call that rsvars.bat script. So let's paste that in. So this is going to go out to program files x86, Embarcadero Studio 19, bin rsvars.bat. So that's going to set up the environment variables needed for MS Build to build a project. Now we need to change into the project directory, and we don't know exactly where Jenkins is going to put that directory at this time. So what we'll do is we'll use a parameter. So I'll put in cd for change directory, %1. So %1 means the first parameter passed to the batch script. So we're going to change into the project directory, which is passed as a parameter, and then we're going to call MS Build to build the project, and we're going to pass in the name of the project we want to build, again as a parameter. So I'm going %2 for the second command line parameter. So I'm going to go ahead and save that script, close this file, and now I can drag from my desktop into the Jenkins directory, providing administrator permissions to move the file. So now we have a build project batch script. We're going to use that to build a project from within Jenkins. So what I'm going to do, let's come out of this command prompt, let's go into Jenkins, and we'll create a new job. Now I'm going to click on new item here, and there is an option in here to create a folder, and I find the folders are quite useful for organizing multiple projects. So I'm going to go ahead and say that we are building a folder called packages, because PKG, my amazing project, is a package. So let's go ahead and create a packages folder, and if we click on OK, let Jenkins do its thing, save, and we're back at the dashboard, but we're now in the packages directory. So I'm going to click on up here, and you can see packages listed. I can click into that, and I'm in the packages directory. And now I'm going to go ahead and click on create new jobs to create a new job. This is going to be the my amazing product _ unit test script. So this script is for building the unit test for my amazing product, and I'm going to select a freestyle project here and click OK. Now I could go ahead and give my project a description. This builds and runs the unit test, and then I'm going to actually select this discard old builds, because if I allow old builds to remain on the server, they're going to build up and take space. So I'm going to just go ahead and discard. I'm going to say keep builds for no more than a day and a maximum of 1 builds. Now obviously if we were doing a release build, you might do that differently. You might have a different environment setup, so do what you feel is right here, but I'm going to discard all of my old builds. And then I'm going to come to source code management, click on subversion, and I need the repository URL. So let's go ahead and get that from our SVN server here and paste that in. And then we need to provide credentials to connect to the subversion server. So if I go ahead and click on add, that didn't work. Let's try that again. I have to hold the button down, okay. And then we have Jenkins provider. So I'm going to go to the Jenkins provider, and this is effectively storing credentials within my user account. So I am Craig.Chapman, and it's storing credentials for me on the subversion server under my account here, under global credentials. So I'm going to go ahead and change this now. I want machine, because we want to connect to the subversion server as our machine user. You'll remember we created the machine user there, which is read-only. And then I'm going to come in and grab my password from this password file that I saved on my desktop, and I'll put that into the password field and add. Don't want to store that there. And then if I drop down this list here, we can see machine is listed. So that's going to provide the machine credentials for the subversion repository. Now, where do I want to check out locally? I can set a subdirectory here. Jenkins is going to create a workspace for this project, and at the moment this is set to period, so this will be at the root of that workspace. If I want to, I can actually extend this directory out, which I found is useful if your project has dependencies. Then you can check out each dependency in a subdirectory of the working directory there. But for right now, the period should do just fine. And here we've got this add module button. So if you did have dependencies, you could come in and add a dependency as a module there. Okay, checkout strategy. use update as much as possible, so that will try to update the last checked out version of code. I'm just going to always check out a fresh copy because I'm discarding my old builds and therefore my old checkouts as well. Okay, so that is going to check out our source code. Not going to worry about the build triggers right here. I'm going to show you how to set up build triggers shortly. Build environment, delete workspace before build starts might be useful if you have old files laying about, but I don't think I need that. So now we want to add a build step. So I'm going to go ahead and add a Windows batch command, which is our build step. And what we need to do here is call our script that's going to do the build project. Now I'm going to do that just by providing precisely the path to our script. So that is on the C drive, program files x86, Jenkins scripts, build project.bat. And I'm putting all of that in double quotes because it has spaces in the path name. So on Windows we need to put double quotes around it. And then we need to pass in our parameters for this build. Now you'll remember the first parameter was the directory that the project is in. So the directory I'm going to use here is %workspace %. So this is a Jenkins variable which is going to provide that workspace directory where the source code was checked out into. And because we're using period, we don't need any more than that, so that's our directory. Again, I'm putting the double quotes around here just because there will be spaces when this variable is filled out. And then I need to give the name of the project that I want to build. Well, that was PRJ, my amazing product. Was it my amazing product or my test project? Let's go and check. So desktop, under trunk we have PRJ my test project. I want to make sure I get that correct. My test project.dproj. So that's the dproj file that we want to have built. Now when that builds, let's go ahead and save that and build it so we can see what's going on here. So I'm going to go ahead and hit save, and then we will hit the build now button here. And you should see a build pop up here. Yes, build number 1 is running. And it looks like the build has failed because this little icon has gone red. So we can click into this build and we can go to the console output for the build. And then let's do a scroll down here and see what's actually happened. So we have build failure, failed to execute batch command. This is PRJ my test project. Project file does not exist. So did I name this project incorrectly? Well, we're changing into, this is the CD, change directory instruction. We're changing into this directory here. So let's go and see what this directory looks like. Okay, what we can see is we are in Jenkins workspace packages, my amazing product underscore unit test. So it's created this workspace for us, and it's actually checked out branches, tags, and trunk. So I've got two options here. The reason that my instruction has failed is we're changing to this directory, but the project is a further directory down in the trunk directory. So my options here are I could not check out the branches and tags, we could go back and check out just the trunk, or we can change the directory that we're pointing at. I think I'm going to go with the first. I don't want my build server to check out every branch and every tag. I just want it to check out the trunk. So let's go ahead and reconfigure our project. In Jenkins, we'll come back to project, into configure. Let's go and take a look at that subversion location. We just want to extend that with /trunk. So that will now download the trunk version of our code. Let's save it and hit build now again. This time we get build number 2 with a little blue icon here. This means that the project did build. So let's go and take a look at the console output for that. And again, we can see that we are changing directory. Where's the instruction? Expected configuration file. It's before that. We're changing directory here into this workspace directory. So I'm going to go and take a look in the workspace directory now. And you can see that we have a Win32 directory that's appeared. So we've checked out the trunk and it's built it and it's created this Win32 directory. I'm going to double click in here, come into debug, and there is my test project. So if we extend our workspace path with Win32 debug, then we can get to the executable here. So let's go back to our project and configure it to build and run the unit test. So I'm going to come into configure for this project again. I'm going to scroll down to the build step here and add another build step, execute batch command. Now this is going to be, we want to execute this workspace directory extended with Win32 debug, and then the name of our project, PRJ my test project. And that of course is a .exe file. Now we also want to pass in a parameter to this unit test project so that it doesn't do that pause and wait for an enter key that I showed you in the IDE earlier. And we can just pass the parameter --exit :continue. So that is the instruction to a dunit_eggs project to simply continue on exit rather than waiting for a key to be pressed. So I'm going to save this and I'm going to go ahead and hit build now, and we're going to start build number 3, and icon is flashing, and it is completed, and the icon is blue, which means all apparently went according to plan. So let's click in and go into the console output again, scroll right down to the bottom, and we can see our unit tests, 3 tests found, test passed 3. So that is our Jenkins server setup to do a build. However, how do we set Jenkins up to build our project only when we check source code into the subversion repository? Well, let's take a look. Okay, so we want our SVN server to trigger a build in Jenkins of our unit test project. Now, in order to do that, we need to provide credentials that the subversion server can use to log into Jenkins to trigger the build. So what I'm going to do is in Jenkins here, I'm going to come to Manage Jenkins. I'm going to scroll down to Manage Users, and we can see here the Craig Chapman user, that's me. I'm going to go ahead and create user. The username I'm going to put machine, as we did with the subversion server, and I'm actually going to reuse the same password here. So we'll put password and confirm password, and I guess we'll just put in machine and no reply at embarcadero.com for an example email address, and we'll create that machine user. Okay, so we have this user which is able to trigger builds now. So let's configure this user and just check that we have everything we need in here. I believe we have everything we need in there. That's good. Now the other thing we need to do is to come into Manage Jenkins, into Configure Global Security, and I'm going to allow anyone who's signed in can do anything, including anonymous read access. So I'm going to turn on Allow Anonymous Read Access. Now this is a very open security model, and the way that I like to run my Jenkins server is I actually only run it locally. I don't open port 8080 to the public. It's running on local host, and I'll remote desktop into my server to administer Jenkins. And the reason I do that is I'm a single developer. I don't have a team. I don't need Active Directory or LDAP. If you have other configurations going on with users and groups, then you might want to configure this more securely, and I'll let you read the documentation to figure out how that's done exactly. But what I'm going to do for myself here is just allow anonymous read access, which is required by our trigger script to read the directories, read the projects that are on our Jenkins server so that it can find the one that needs to be executed. So I'm going to turn that permission on and save that setting. Okay, so now we should be able to trigger a build in Jenkins from the command line. And in order to do that, I'm going to need another script. So I'm going to open up Notepad, and I'm going to save as, again, to my desktop initially, and we'll call this build trigger .bat, and make sure it's a .bat file. And then I'm going to go ahead and copy paste a line of text in here. So this should be %1. So what we're going to do here is we are calling Java on the command line, which is installed with Jenkins, and we're passing in -jar. So we're saying we want to execute a .jar file. Then we're specifying the path to that .jar file, and that file comes from the Jenkins installation, it is jenkins-cli.jar. So this is CLI, command line interface, the command line interface for Jenkins. We're passing in the parameter -s, which is -server, telling it where the Jenkins server is, and the server is on localhost 8080. We're giving it the instruction build, so that's going to build a job or project for us. Then we're passing in this command line parameter, which is the job that we want built. Then we're going to pass in --username machine, --, password, and we need our password from earlier. So I'll go ahead and paste that in. So this is the command line instruction to execute a build, to execute a job on the Jenkins server. And the password is stored here in plain text in the file. You can actually provide a passwords file to Jenkins. I recommend you read up on how to do that for your own sake of understanding with regards to the security model. However, I'm going to be saving this in our scripts directory on our local server anyway, and so it's about as secure as any other file on the file system, so I'm not going to worry about placing it in the script file here, hard-coded as a password. So I'm going to go ahead and save that and move that into our Jenkins directory under scripts. Now the other important thing to note here is that Java does need to be on the command path. So if I right click on this file and go edit, we could put in the Jenkins, the Java path, which was installed with Jenkins. So let's do that. Let's go up a directory here into the Jenkins install directory, and we can see JRE, that's the Java runtime environment. And if we look inside here in the bin directory, we'll find Java as a binary there. So I'm going to take this path, and I'm just going to make sure that when we run this script, the path contains at least that JRE directory. Now this line may be unnecessary depending on your setup and your environment if Java is on your command path already. But for the time being, I'm going to put it in here just to make sure that we have that in our setup, and save it. And then if we come and open up a command prompt, then I'm going to bring us into our scripts directory under Jenkins. So I'm going to go ahead and grab that directory, change directory, paste in our scripts directory, and I should be able to call from here build trigger, and then if I pass in the project name, it should begin a build. So let's go ahead and click into packages, and this is the project I want to launch. So that's going to be packages / my amazing product _unit test. Let's see if this works. It certainly looks like it launched to the instruction. I don't see the build up here on the build queue, so maybe it didn't work. Ah, it did. So we're at build number 4. We saw that we didn't see that execute. So let's come back up to my amazing product and reissue that trigger one more time, just so we can see it actually trigger the build here. We should see a build number 5 come up. There it is. So we're triggering our builds from the command line now. So all we really need to do is take that command line instruction, build trigger, and put it into our subversion setup. So I'm going to go back into the subversion server, right click on my repository, and go to properties. Under hooks, instead of the pre-commit hook, this time we want the post-commit hook. So in the post-commit hook, we need to provide the directory of our build trigger script. So I'm going to go ahead and mark this and copy it all out. So that's the directory of the script and the script name itself. So I'm going to copy that and just make sure that I put the correct character in there. So we are calling our build trigger.bat file, and we're going to pass in as a parameter packages / my amazing product _unit test. So when I do a check-in now, that should automatically trigger a build on my Jenkins server. Let's go ahead and test it. I'm going to open up the My Amazing Product folder. I'm going to come into our trunk directory, and let's find a file to modify, let's say utest1. So I'm just going to go ahead and modify that file. Let's do it in the IDE real quick. Let's put a empty line at the top of the file there and save it. So as far as the subversion server is concerned, we've modified that file. little icon here has gone red. So if I go commit, that's going to commit it in. I need to give it a comment. So I'm going to say test build trigger and check that in. And it's gone off and it's thinking, it's come back saying revision 5 is okay. So if we come and take a look on our Jenkins build server, we can see we're now at build number 6, and that was initiated by our check-in. Now the useful thing about this is that Jenkins can now tell us if something goes wrong. So if we come back into our IDE, let's make one of the unit tests fail. So we'll look at test 1 and we'll say assert is true, false, which is of course going to fail. So I'm going to go ahead and check that change in. Commit, testing, just testing. Let's go ahead and check that in. And a new build should be initiated for my amazing product. And you can see that build number 7 has failed. It's gone red. And so if we go and take a look in the console output, scroll down to the bottom, we can see tests found 3, passed 2, failed 1. So we now know that our Jenkins server is aware also that our build is failing. So now the next thing we can do is if we come up into Jenkins and go to Manage Jenkins, under say, I think it's Configure System, so we'll take a look there and scroll all the way down. And yes, we have these SMTP server details. So we can pass in the details of an SMTP server and have Jenkins give us an email whenever the build fails or whenever the unit test fails. So I'm going to go ahead and put these details in. I'm not going to record myself doing this because I don't want to share my SMTP server details, but go ahead and put your SMTP details into your installation and you can have it send you notifications, and I'll come back and show you how that works in just a moment. Before I do that though, there is a setting that we should change right here near the top. Under the Jenkins location, we have the system admin email, which is not yet configured. Regardless of whether or not your SMTP settings are correct, if you don't put an email address in here, Jenkins will continually fail to send an email, and it can be quite frustrating to debug why that's happening. So go ahead and I'm going to put in, actually I'm going to put in no reply at Embarcadero.com. So that's my server's email address. Save that and then put in the SMTP details. Okay, so I have configured Jenkins with my SMTP details. I'm going to come into packages, and the My Amazing Product package is currently failing. So I'm going to come in here and hit configure. I'm going to scroll down to the bottom of my build job, and I'm going to put in a post build action here, and that is going to be an email notification. So I can select here send an email for every unstable build. I can specify recipients, and I can send emails separately to individuals that broke the build. I'm going to go ahead and put myself in here as a recipient and hit save. Now the first thing I'm going to do is correct the build because it's currently failing. So I'm going to comment out this line of code that caused the unit test to fail, and I'm going to commit those changes into the repository. Okay, and I'm going to cheat with my comment here. Okay, so that is now checked in, and we can see the build running. And that is actually successfully built. Now, I may well get, yes I did, I got an email notification telling me that the build is back to normal. So if I scroll this onto the screen here, we can see I have Jenkins build is back to normal, packages, my amazing product, blah, blah, blah. And so let's go ahead and break the build and see that happen one more time with a broken build. So I'll put our unit test fail back in and check it in one more time. Okay, and we are on build 8 currently. We should see build 9 come up. And as soon as that finishes, we ought to get a notification saying the build is broken. And here it is. I have an email here saying the build is broken. So it's telling me the comment was break it. This was the comment that was submitted when I checked in the source code. And then I have the entire command line output here including the test output at the footer. So this is going to send me a notification for when the build is broken, and every time I commit after it is broken, while it remains broken, I will get a reminder, this is broken, this is broken. As soon as it is fixed, I'll get the build is back to normal notification, and the server will go quiet and stop sending me annoying messages. So this is very useful if you need to know when your build has been checked in inappropriately and your trunk is therefore broken. And so that is continuous integration with Jenkins.
Excellent. And so you had the scripts you put in the Jenkins as well. I don't think, or yeah, were like the or the subversion script that like required a check-in or a comment on check-in and stuff like that.
Right. So I have the pre-commit hook and the post-commit.
Oh, there it is. Yep, pre-commit hook.
And the bits of code that you put into Jenkins, actually, I will add them to this page. Watch this space. But so long as you know about the workspace variable, it's you're calling the build project script from wherever you are. So you call this with an absolute path and just put in the workspace variable for the project.
Excellent. So, and I know we talked about also doing a future webinar using Final Builder, which is a great tool, which is interestingly, the DUnit X is by Vincent Perrett, who is the creator of Final Builder. So I saw at one point scroll past with his email address in the credits for that. And I was like, oh, that's right.
Yes, I would love to do one on Final Builder. I'm less experienced with Final Builder, and so I'll do a little research, learn how to work with it, and then I'll happily put one together for you.
Excellent. So some good feedback here from David about the new dark theme not showing up very well. That's true. Didn't even think about that because of the fact that it's actually designed to be a low contrast theme. So for webinars, it's just not going to look very well. So now I'm thinking, with 10.22, you can use custom themes. So I wonder if we have a theme that has higher contrast we could use.
We could do a webinar specific theme.
Yeah, exactly. So the question here, what happens if you have two different projects with different paths for search path, DC output, etc.? Will MS Build correctly read that info from the dproj file and compile each project with its own settings, even in parallel?
Yes. So effectively, it's just going to be launched as two separate processes. Jenkins has a number of workers, which are threads, but those threads then launch processes. And so, yeah, it's just going to launch it in two different, effectively hidden MS shells. And each of those shells can have their own environment variables, their own settings, and so on. And MS Build will pick up all of the dependency paths it needs from each of the projects. Obviously, if you are pointing at DCUs, you need to have those DCUs built first. So your Jenkins script needs to be built such that the dependencies are built first, and then it will build everything on top of that. I actually have a development server right now with, so I took down my old development server a while ago, and I just recently put it back up. And I think I've got about 7 or 8 packages in my server right now, and each one successively depends on the previous. And so I've got this ever-increasing complexity of Jenkins scripts to go build the dependencies first.
Wow. Is RSVAR's BAT automatically generated by Delphi, or can it be customized?
So it's not generated by Delphi, it's installed with it. It's in the Delphi bin directory. So you can customize it, but not within the bin directory. If you change anything in Delphi's bin directory, it starts to get upset with you. So you could certainly copy it out of there, place it somewhere else, and then it's just a regular BAT file that you can go modify. And really all it's doing is setting up the path information so that MS Build can go find the Delphi compiler, can go find the Embarcadero linker, and so on. So it's just setting up those variables for MS Build to have what it needs, its dependencies.
Excellent. Another question here. Let's say you have a group of developers. Let's say you have, we'll say, 50 developers going. What happens if you check one developer checks in some code, and while that build's running, another developer checks in some code?
So the builds will be, it'll still do both builds, but it will schedule them. So when one is complete, it'll kick off the next, or if it has sufficient workers, it will launch two at a time. But it's going to check out a specific revision. So what will happen is when you trigger that build, so the first developer checks in, it's at revision 30, whatever it might be. Then the Jenkins job is going to check out revision 30, and it'll stack up the checkout of revision 31 when that is checked in. So yeah, that's going to schedule the jobs in series. And it might be that your second developer checking in, it could be the same guy correcting a incorrect file on the previous check-in. So you'd with the notifications there, you get the build is broken, the build is back to normal, almost within the same few seconds, depending on how long the build takes.
Yeah. Now, I may have missed that part. You can configure the number of workers you have?
Yeah, so you can configure, effectively, it is the number of threads that Jenkins is spawning. So you can configure that number of threads to say Jenkins has 9 threads or whatever. And then each one of those threads, when it runs through a Jenkins job, will launch the relevant processes and wait for them to complete. So if you check in 9 builds all at the same time, then it'll use all 9 of those threads, and anything else you check in will be stacked up for the first available thread. And in Jenkins speak, I believe they're called workers as opposed to threads, but that's effectively what it is.
Is there any rule of thumb for how many workers you should configure on a build server?
Good question. Honestly, I don't know. I think it's going to vary from environment to environment. I know that because I haven't used this commercially in 5-6 years now. I'm using it as kind of a hobby solo developer now. But in the commercial setting, we were running only a couple of 3 workers. Now, I personally, on my own setup, I limit it all to 1 because there's only me checking in, so it doesn't need more than 1. But yeah, it's going to depend on your environment. I don't know that there's a really satisfying rule of thumb for it.
Okay, I was just wondering if it was like number of cores plus 1 or something.
Obviously, you don't want to exceed the hardware you're running on. But if you do exceed the hardware you're running on, it's going to become obvious pretty quickly. So.
Okay. So there's a good question here. The reason is about building a group of projects which shares paths. It could be customized for each path. Oh, I think this is elaborating on the previous question. Yeah. Okay. Is Jenkins able to build an Android target?
Well, yes, in that your Delphi is able to build an Android target. So it's not dependent on Jenkins. Jenkins is just going to kick off MS Build, which is going to launch your RAD Studio build process. So whatever you've got configured in there for RAD Studio is what it's going to do. And because you're on the build server, I only set it up in the demonstration for Windows, but you could, of course, set your build server up to deploy to Android. Now, obviously, you'll need to connect a Android device to it for the first time to get the SDK, but after that, yes, it'll build Android targets.
Yeah. Now, for those of us that have been around for a while, way back in the day, we did all our command line builds from DCC32. So why do you use MS Build over DCC32?
Good question. So, and I'm not entirely clear on. I never have used DCC32, but MS Build is it's a full build environment. It's not just calling the command line compiler, right? So it's going to go out and get, it's going to understand the project dependencies better. It's going to get the configuration paths. You don't have to put all of that in yourself as you would with the command line compiler. So that's one possible reason, but I've just always done it this way. I've never used the command line compiler to do automated builds.
So my understanding, which is also limited, is that that's a big part of it there. But then the other thing was that it used to be that if you were doing the DCC32 versus the IDE builds, they wouldn't be the same because, like you said, you have to pass all that configuration in. So when you're doing it via the MS Build, it does the exact same configuration as you have in the IDE because it pulls all that information for you. And then plus also if you're building Android versus Windows versus Win64 or whatever, it handles all that and calls all the appropriate compilers. So yeah, MS Build is a better solution because it managed all that for you, like you're saying. So yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, exactly that is for the previous question with regards to Android. If you wanted to build for Android, obviously you need to call the Android compiler. But if you're calling MS Build, it can find out from your project file what it should be calling. So
yep.
There's that option, and I believe you can override the target in MS Build as well, although I don't know the option off the top of my head for it.
Is it possible to pass version information to MS Build to set the product version based on the current SVN for revision, for example?
I don't know.
I've seen that done with an include file before. You could you increment an include, you extract it to an include file, and then that gets included in the or something.
Right. But what's interesting is the project file is going to have with the exception of the build number, the project file is going to have the version number in it anyway, and then the build number is in the project file. So I'd need to check to be sure, but I believe that when you call MS Build to do a build, it'll increment that that build number, I think. So yeah, it's an interesting question. I don't know is the short answer, but I'll take that away and see if I can figure it out.
Interesting, yeah. Sometimes resources should be shared and contain unique components like some binary info. How to store that, or should it be stored separately?
So yeah, I mean, ideally you'd want to store this separately. Avoid putting the resources in Subversion unless you need them under version control. So if they're going to change frequently, then yeah, if you're going to edit them frequently, then you might want to put them in version control. But ideally, have them installed on the build server in a separate setup. The build server is able to go out, you've got Jenkins is being triggered. So in terms of which is continuous integration and which is build, technically our build server here is actually the Subversion server, because it's triggering the builds on Jenkins, which is then doing the continuous integration. But because we're using something which isn't really a build server, because it's SVN, Jenkins actually is going to take on both roles. So within Jenkins, you can go out to other directories on your build server and pull resources and files in, and embed the knowledge of what's in the environment into your Jenkins setup. So you can do it that way. If it's shared components across multiple builds, then that's going to be the most convenient way to do it.
Yeah, that's true. I remember in the past actually using the MS Build triggers in the environment to move some files around that were necessary for build and compile and debugging and stuff like that. So you could do it from there as well. I think if you just have to make sure you're using absolute paths that were relevant locally as well as on the build server, I would think.
That's right. And the other thing to remember, of course, is that you are running, when you're running your Jenkins builds, all Jenkins is really doing is, on an abstract level, it's your build server, it's your CI server, but on a technical level, it's really just a scheduler, right? So, if you boil it down to what its basic function is, it's a cron system. It's going to schedule batch scripts. And what that means is that because it's just launching a batch, you can put whatever you want in that script. If you want to have one build job builds and runs your unit tests, have another build job with a slightly different name, also triggered from your check-in. You can have another build job which will go deploy your binary to an FTP so that the latest build is on the website for your customers to download or whatever it might be. You can automate just about anything you want with it. So yep. Very, very powerful thing to be able to just launch batch files, frankly.
And Matthew Vesper pointed out that Final Builder, Vincent Perret, also has a continuous integration, continuous CI, which they have a free version as well. So actually, Matthew, if you're familiar with that, we'd love to have you do a webinar. Maybe you could team up with Craig on that one. Because yeah, we'd love to highlight that one. Just Craig wasn't as familiar with that one. But yeah, and I think, I used Final Builder a while ago, and it was a long time ago. And I found that it had automation for a lot of that stuff that you wanted to do, but like like you're talking about having it post to FTP and stuff like that. It was like, oh, I'll just check this box, put the FTP path, boom, and it would just do that for you, if I remember correctly. So that was really a great benefit there for that. So definitely check out Final Builder and Continua for sure if you're interested in that, because they do have a lot of things to simplify some things. So Matthew says he's not familiar with it yet, but he's going to check it out. Great. So
it's certainly, I would love to learn more about it. So from what I've seen of it, so they do separate out the concepts of automated build server and continuous integration, which is great. That's how it should be done, because your continuous integration server shouldn't really care about the details of your development. It doesn't need to know what binaries depend on what and all that kind of stuff. Your continuous integration should really be focused on your environment. So where are my FTP servers? Where is my source code located? And so on. And then your build server, automated build server, which Final Builder stands for, that's concerned with development. So once the CI server provides it with all the information it needs, then the build server can go off and build the executable because it's been gets dependencies and information. So it's a very good way of separating out those concerns. And that's the way that Continuous CI and Final Builder operate. So it's certainly very interesting to me. But when I was looking at it to consider doing a webinar on it, and with a limited time frame, I'm not familiar with it, and I didn't know how to use it. And I'm just thinking, well, I'm not going to put together a webinar on something I don't know. So I'll switch back to what I do know, which is Jenkins, and put that one together. And then we can look at Final Builder in a future session. So yeah, very interested to see it.
So Claude's saying that he wasn't able to get Final Builder to build Android, unfortunately, which is interesting. I wonder if it was a matter of, I'm not sure the details on that. That's surprising.
So I know you can build Target. It may be worth, I would expect it should be able to do it. It may be something worth checking with their support on, because yeah, my understanding is it should be able to do any of the supported targets.
How do you handle third-party components?
Yeah, the simple answer, the short answer is you install them when you install the RAD IDE. So you install them on your build server. If this becomes potentially problematic each time you upgrade your IDE and your third-party components, you effectively have to upgrade your build server. So it can be problematic using third-party components. If you're able to do it, and I know that very often third-party vendors will charge an additional fee for source code, but if you're able to do it, get the source code, because then you don't necessarily have to upgrade the components. You can just build them from source in the next edition. So.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say, is that what we did is in the past is we always had source control and just check the source code into the version control, and then as you we upgraded it, and sometimes we would fix bugs in the third-party components. So as you went through and did all that stuff, you just pushed the new versions or whatever into source control.
I'm actually hoping, so we've been putting a lot more over time. We're putting more and more components in to get it, and as that fleshes out and we get more and more components in there, one of the nice things is that I can conceive of a point in the future where you could script install the components you depend on, because you can just go call the get it executable and have it go download the bits you need. So I can see that as something conceivable coming in the future, but it's not something that we can do right now. Yeah,
I was actually thinking that same thing. Claude's saying that the Final Builder only supports Linux 64 and OS 32 and Windows. So interesting. Yeah, I'll have to look into that. I'm not sure why. I'm not familiar enough with Final Builder to know about that. So.
Yeah, I mean, I'll take your word for it, but it surprises me, because even if the target isn't supported by Final Builder is not what's doing the build, right? It's calling the Delphi system. So yeah, I'll look into that in more detail and see if we can find out what the deal is there, because It may be, so just to give you a heads up, the last time I tried using Final Builder was quite recently. And as I said, I wasn't familiar enough to put together a webinar on it, but I did try importing a project. And I found that although the latest compiler is supported, so 10.2.2 is supported, it wasn't included in the import wizard. And so I got a hold of, I think it was Vincent, I got a hold of, and he said, okay, that's an oversight in the current build, I'll fix that for you. And he put up a new build. So I believe that the intention is for them to support all of our supported targets and compilers. So if one of them isn't in there, like I said, I'll look into it. I can't see why they would omit it. You know, it's just a matter of calling a different compiler as far as the product is concerned.
I was just scrolling through Final Builder's site here, and wow, they have a lot of features in here. So you can have, there's a built-in action to have it start your web server, or you know, all sorts of stuff. This is really extensive.
Yeah, I mean, it's so effectively from what I keep saying I'm not familiar, but from what I've seen of it, it has it's giving you basically a UI for your build process. So anything you can do in a script, you ought to be able to do by launching a script from the Final Builder setup. So it may not specifically be included in the product feature, but if it's not, then you should still be able to launch it in a batch script, just as you can with Jenkins. Because, I mean, fundamentally, under the hood, they're performing the same task, right? So, but what it does is it gives you a lot of UIs for working with the configuration settings of various things that you might need to access while doing your builds. And so it makes it a much more visual process rather than writing batch scripts. But you should still be able to fall back to writing batch scripts if you need to do that.
Great. All right. Well, thank you so much, Craig, for this webinar. Sorry for the miscommunication on the times, but glad we're able to get going here just a few minutes late.
No worries, pulled it out.
Oh, here's one more question here. Bob's saying, at least with using Git with a distributed team, the project files get modified sometimes by the IDE, even when no source code is found. And this is the most frequent cause of conflicts requiring human intervention. Any advice for mitigating that? And he says, yes, we do ignore the .local files. I know I've seen that sometimes the form files are what usually get me, is that sometimes I'll open it and for some reason my IDE will stream the form file back out differently than the other person did.
Right. But the thing that I'm thinking is if the project file is being modified, the question is why? Because so the only time I ever see a project file get modified myself is when I change the units within it or which forms are within it, right? So, right. Or I go in and I change the project options or something like that. So if something's changing in there, the question is what's changing and why? So I'd have to do an exploration on, you know, what's actually causing that to know how to, you know, to how to resolve it.
So one other tool that you didn't discuss, which I think is totally should be in everybody's tool belt, whether you're doing continuous integration or not, is Beyond Compare. And my process in the past has always been when I'm, you know, get ready to do a commit. First of all, you always do small changes, right? So you should be going, you know, checking out the code, fixing one bug, adding one feature, whatever, doing a commit. And every time I go to do a commit, I go through the list of changed files, and if in my mind I cannot say, oh, I know why this was changed, or I don't know why this was changed, especially like form files. If I wasn't editing the form, I do a Beyond Compare, look at it and say, those aren't my changes, and ignore and revert those files. So I'm only committing what I consciously know I just changed based on what I was working on. So if you are seeing, and you know, there's going to be little things that, you know, some file you accidentally modified, or something where the IDE makes a change or you save, and especially if you're loading it where someone else made a change on their system and you're loading it in, there could be some configuration you have different on your system that's going to possibly cause a change someplace, you know, in the dproj or whatever. I look at that and say, I did not intentionally do that, and I'll revert it. And so if I do revert the file, I always do a local build first to make sure that for some reason, I wasn't depending on that change when I did my local testing.
Yeah, and actually I did, so I avoided talking about it in the session. What I actually said was that when you do a merge of a branch back in with main trunk, it can get complex if you have conflicting changes in the two different versions. And my statement was there are tools included with Tortoise to help you deal with that. And that's true. There is a diff tool included with Tortoise SVN, which will allow you to do diffs in a similar way to Beyond Compare, but in no way does it compete with Beyond Compare. Beyond Compare is, to my mind, the best diff tool out there.
Oh yeah, I use Beyond Compare beyond just source control too, because it has all the FTP and file comparison and stuff like that. It's one of my all-time favorite tools.
Yeah.
It's just so fantastic. And they have the three-way merge now in the new version that they released a few years ago, I guess now, but so you can do a three-way merge. Yeah. Which is great when you have that, especially with source control, right, where you have the base version is changed versus the one you have and stuff like that. So,
I really enjoy my current position at Embarcadero. Is a lot of fun. I really enjoy it. But the one thing I miss is that I'm no longer part of an actual development team. And so these kind of daily challenges of how do you diff these two different files? Because, Bob's checking in X and Frank's checking in Y. And how do we deal with the merge? These kind of challenges, believe it or not, I miss them because it's always fun to have to deal with that kind of thing. And then when you find the resolution, you get that gratification of having fixed a problem. So.
Yeah, agreed. So everybody, if you do run into problems like that, talk to Craig, and he's excited to work with you. But yeah, I agree. There's a lot of things that you are, when you're part of a build team, that you do a lot of problems that are different that you tackle than you don't otherwise.
Yeah.
And actually, interesting. Someone was asking me, my teenage son, who's looking at different career possibilities and such. He said, "What is it that you enjoy about your job?" I said, "You know what? Really, the big thing I enjoy about it, or one of the big things I enjoy about it, is solving problems. Where you come up with something that's like, why doesn't this work? And you figure it out. Oh, that's why it doesn't work. And you're able to figure these things out. And so, yeah, that can be very enjoyable.
Software development is quite literally at a fundamental level problem solving. I'm following someone on YouTube recently, just came out and said, "What does a software developer actually do?" That was kind of the title of the video, and it boils down to problem solving. And that, if you don't enjoy problem solving, then you shouldn't go into software engineering at all.
Yep. All right, fantastic. Looks like we've gotten through the questions, unless I missed something there. And if I did, I apologize. But you can get a hold of us online, and we'll be happy to answer them. And otherwise, we're gonna go. So thanks so much, Craig, and we'll talk to everybody later.
Catch you later.
Bye, everybody.
I have put up on the screen here the blog post which accompanies the session. Unfortunately, there was no intro or outro card on the recording there. So if you head over to my blog at Chapman World, subversion-Jenkins-Delphi-and-me, that is the accompanying blog post with the source for the batch files and the hooks on the page there.
Now, I have a question here. Let's say you're not hosting your own source control, you're using some externally hosted source control. Can you still use Jenkins to automate your build process, or do you need to be hosting the source control?
No, you can absolutely still do it. You have a number of options. If you have access to the hooks, then you can still call via the web interface. You can trigger a build on Jenkins. And you can also have Jenkins poll the source code server. So there's a setting in there that tells it to check the source code server every minute or two to see what revision we're at, and then it'll go check out the latest one when it finds a new one. So yeah, you can still use Jenkins to do with third-party hosted source control.
Yeah, it's good to see the basics, especially the fact that you use stored source or the unit testing, because I know a lot of people are still figuring out unit testing, trying to set if it's right for them. I remember when I was working at one company where we had to convince the manager that we needed to use source control. Because he was, before myself and some of the developers were hired, he was just using emailing changed files back and forth.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, so I've been using this obviously since joining Embarcadero. I'm not actually part of an engineering team anymore. I'm consulting with them. But back when I was on an engineering team, we used pretty much this exact same setup. I mean, we had a couple of additional scripts to integrate the bug tracker, which I think was Jira at the time. And for agile development, we had target process integrated as well. But effectively the same setup on the Jenkins server side. And I mean, this was an international company with multiple development teams in multiple languages, and by which I mean software languages. And Jenkins just held up and did its job. So I like to still use it myself for personal projects. And even if you are just doing this for a single developer, maybe even a hobbyist, having source control just lets you go back and see where something changed. You change something, forget what you did, why you did it. Source control lets you go back and read the notes and see what happened. It's all very useful to have set up.
Yep, agreed. Is there a way to view the build state directly in RAD Studio?
Without additional scripting, I don't believe so. It's not like we have an integrated Jenkins bit of the IDE, so I don't believe so. As you've seen, you can have it send email notifications, so it wouldn't be impossible to set up. You could have a script that checks a particular mailbox to watch for fail notifications or something like that. So it could be done, but it's not something that we have an existing solution for.
Extremely useful, saves time. Wish I'd been doing it years ago. Yep, that's one of those things that there's so many things as a software developer that once you start doing, you're like, why haven't I not done this before?
Absolutely. And actually, one of the things, so I think I messaged you recently. I'd not been keeping up with my unit tests for some time. And I finally go back in and start writing them, which, of course, if you're writing them after the fact, it's not really a proper unit test anyway, and it's a bit of a chore. But as I was putting the unit tests in, I think I messaged you and said, wouldn't you know it, I put my unit tests in and I've discovered 3 bugs already. So it's a valuable exercise. It means that you can have more confidence in your in the quality of your code base.
Yep, so true. It's actually there's an awesome unit testing. What is it? Test Insight by Stefan Linke. That is incredibly useful extension to doing unit testing development that I highly recommend as well. But you could someone else could totally make an extension for Jenkins that showed current build status in the IDE as well. So lots of possibilities out there.
Another thing that I quite like using, far be it for me to recommend products, but one product I've really enjoyed working with, though it is not inexpensive, is Test Complete. Because Test Complete will allow you to, what you can't do in unit tests really is test the graphical output of your application, right? So it's not really easy to test what's coming out on the screen. But what you can do with Test Complete is you can actually script automated tests where it will launch your application, click buttons for you, read the labels and see if they're presenting the data they should be, investigate what's going on in a grid, all this kind of stuff. And you could integrate that quite tightly with Jenkins as well. So you could have it do your automated QA as well as your automated unit testing. And don't forget, you could also, with Jenkins, we're really talking about a sophisticated, but nonetheless, basically a cron server, which is running batch scripts. So anything you can script in a batch file, you can have Jenkins do. And that might also include building your release build, building your installer file, depositing it on an FTP site for the customers to download. So yeah, very useful to have the server there doing the mundane tasks for you, freeing you up from.
Yep. It's also planned in the future. We're going to do more around DevOps, but also planning to do something around Final Builder and continuous CI as well. So those are some great tools by Vincent Perret, who is the developer of the DUnit X. So take a look at those if you're interested. They automate a lot of the additional tasks you can do as well, developed specifically for working with Delphi as well as other development tools if you have a mixed collection of tools you're developing with. All right. Well, thank you so much, Craig. And we're going to spend some more time troubleshooting your audio trouble, and hopefully we get that figured out for future webinars.
Yep. Thank you very much, Jim.
You're welcome. Thank you. Bye-bye.